Sometimes life sends us messengers when we least expect them, carrying pleas that touch the deepest corners of our hearts. There's something sacred about the trust that forms between souls, even when they come from different worlds entirely. Colton Reeves was a weathered cowboy who thought he'd seen everything the Wyoming wilderness could offer. But two small bear cubs were about to prove him wrong. These little ones began following him every day, staying close but never approaching. Their eyes held something desperate, something that spoke to the part of him that understood what it meant to need help. When he finally followed them into the deep timber, what he found changed everything. A wounded mother bear lay dying in a hidden hollow, and somehow these cubs had chosen him as their only hope. But why had they trusted a stranger with something so precious? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like an old man's memories, soft and persistent, refusing to be hurried away by the autumn sun. Colton Reeves pulled his grandfather's silver pocket watch from his vest, 5:47 a.m., same as always. For 58 years he'd been rising before dawn, and for the last 40 of those, he'd been working this same stretch of Wyoming rangeland that his grandfather had claimed and his father had expanded. The watch caught the first light filtering through his kitchen window, its familiar weight a comfort in his weathered palm. The Reeves Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of rolling hills and creek bottoms, bounded by the Bridger National Forest to the west and the Powder River to the east. 3 generations of his family had called this place home, had worked its soil, mended its fences, and knew every draw and ridge like the lines on their own hands. Colton could still remember his grandfather telling him that a man's true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the number of sunrises he witnessed over land that knew his footsteps. He set the watch on the kitchen table beside his morning coffee, black as creek water after a storm. The silence in the house felt heavier these days, more noticeable since Mary passed 2 years ago come December. She used to fill these early hours with the gentle sounds of breakfast preparation, humming old hymns while she scrambled eggs and fried bacon. Now there was just the ticking of the mantel clock and the whisper of wind through the eaves. The kitchen still held traces of her presence, the blue and white checkered curtains she'd sewn, the ceramic rooster collection on the windowsill, the cast-iron skillet seasoned by decades of her cooking. Colton had left everything exactly as she'd arranged it, not from inability to move forward, but from a quiet recognition that some things were meant to remain unchanged. Memory had its own geography, and he'd learned to navigate it carefully. His children had grown up in this house, had learned to ride horses in the south pasture, had helped with spring branding and fall roundups until college called them away to different lives in distant cities. Sarah was a lawyer in Denver now, married to a banker with soft hands who'd never sat a horse. Tom worked for some tech company in Seattle, designing things Colton couldn't begin to understand. They called regularly, visited for holidays when they could, but their lives had grown beyond the boundaries of the ranch, beyond the rhythm of seasons that had shaped generations before them. Colton finished his coffee and stepped onto the front porch, breathing in air that carried the scent of sage and the promise of frost. October in Wyoming painted the aspens gold and set the cottonwoods along the creek to rustling with their own quiet conversations. The mountains to the west wore caps of early snow, and the sky stretched endless and blue, broken only by the V-shaped flight of geese heading south. His border collie, Rex, appeared from wherever he'd been patrolling, tail wagging with the eternal optimism that came with the prospect of a day's work. Rex had been Mary's dog originally, a rescue from the animal shelter in town. But after her passing, the dog had attached himself to Colton with unwavering loyalty. Some grief, Colton had learned, was best shared. The barn held the familiar smells of leather and hay, of horses and the honest sweat of labor. Colton saddled Ranger, a 15-year-old quarter horse with intelligent eyes and the good sense to trust his rider's judgment. They'd been partners for 8 years now, long enough to develop the kind of understanding that didn't require words. Ranger knew the routine, as well as Colton did check the water tanks, inspect the fence lines, count the cattle, and keep an eye on the land that sustained them all. The ride to the north pasture took them along Willow Creek, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The creek had been the reason Colton's grandfather had settled here, back when water rights were simpler things and a man's handshake still counted for something. The willows along its banks were bare now, their yellow leaves carpeting the ground like scattered coins. It was Frank Mueller who'd first mentioned the poaching. Frank owned the adjacent spread, 8,000 acres of similar country, and at 72, he was one of the few men left who remembered the old ways of doing things. They'd met at the property line fence 2 weeks ago, and Frank had mentioned finding gut piles and blood trails where they shouldn't be, signs that someone was taking game illegally and leaving waste behind. "Ain't sport hunting," Frank had said, adjusting his battered hat against the sun. "Sport hunters clean their kills proper, take the meat. This is something else, something that don't sit right with a man's conscience." Colton had promised to keep his eyes open, though he'd hoped Frank's concerns were overblown. The National Forest drew its share of hunters each fall, and not all of them understood the ethics that came with taking life from the wild. But if Frank was worried, there was likely reason to be. The old rancher had an eye for trouble that came from decades of reading sign and understanding the natural order of things. Dr. Sarah Chen ran the veterinary practice in town, a 20-minute drive down a gravel road that wound through country where cell phone signals came and went like evening shadows. She'd grown up in California, had come to Wyoming for veterinary school, and had surprised everyone by staying. She was 43, divorced, and had a way of talking to animals that suggested she understood their language better than most people understood English. Colton had known her for 5 years, ever since she'd helped birth a difficult calf during a spring blizzard. She'd worked in the barn by lamplight, her small hands sure and gentle, talking to the cow in soft tones that seemed to calm both mother and child. Since Mary's passing, Dr. Chen had made a point of stopping by the ranch more often than strictly necessary, checking on the horses, bringing supplies, and sharing a cup of coffee when time allowed. There was something between them, unspoken but acknowledged, a recognition of shared solitude, of two people who'd found themselves alone in country that was beautiful but unforgiving of loneliness. Neither had pushed the matter beyond friendship, but the possibility hung between them like morning mist, waiting for the right moment to either dissipate or settle into something more substantial. The day's work followed its familiar pattern, checking water levels, mending a section of fence where elk had pushed through, counting cattle to ensure none had wandered off or fallen prey to the coyotes that sang from the ridges each evening. It was honest work, the kind that left a man tired but satisfied, connected to the land in ways that city folk could never quite understand. But as the afternoon lengthened and the shadows grew longer, Colton found himself thinking about legacy, about what remained when a man's time was finished. His grandfather's watch ticked steadily in his vest pocket, marking time that seemed to move faster each year. The ranch would likely be sold when he was gone. Sarah and Tom had their own lives, their own dreams that didn't include 12,000 acres of Wyoming rangeland. The thought brought a sadness that settled in his chest, like cold weather moving in from the mountains. That evening, he sat on the front porch with Rex at his feet, watching the stars appear in a sky unmarked by city lights. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the rustle of something moving through the grass. This was his world, his life, shaped by seasons and weather, by the needs of animals and the demands of land that asked much but gave back in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. Somewhere in the darkness, he knew wild creatures were going about their ancient business, deer moving down to water, elk grazing in moonlit meadows, bears preparing for winter's long sleep. It was a world that operated by rules older than human understanding, governed by instincts and needs that connected all living things in ways both beautiful and harsh. As he prepared for bed, Colton found himself wondering what the next day would bring. unaware that it would introduce him to messengers whose trust would challenge everything he thought he knew about his purpose in this vast and lonely country. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Colton rode out at dawn with Rex trotting alongside Ranger, following the familiar path toward the creek, where the cattle liked to water. The air held that sharp clarity that came with October mornings, clean and cold enough to make a man's breath visible. Frost silvered the grass, and the aspens along the creek rustled their golden leaves like nature's own wind chimes. He was checking the salt licks in the north pasture when he first noticed them, two small, dark shapes moving through the timber about 50 yards away. At first glance, he took them for black bear cubs, which wouldn't be unusual this time of year. Bears were fattening up for winter, and mothers often brought their young down from the high country to forage in the creek bottoms, where the service, berries and rose hips grew thick. But something about their movement caught his attention. Instead of the random wandering typical of foraging bears, these two seemed to be moving with purpose, staying roughly parallel to his path. When he stopped to adjust a salt block, they stopped too. When he mounted Ranger and continued along the fence line, they resumed their shadowing movement through the trees. "What do you make of that, boy?" he asked Rex, who had noticed the cubs as well, and was watching them with the alert attention of a dog whose herding instincts extended beyond cattle. Colton waved his hat in their direction and called out, hoping to spook them back toward their mother. Young bears could be dangerous if they became too comfortable around humans, and a protective mother bear was nothing to take lightly. But instead of running, the cubs sat down and watched him, their dark eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed almost human. The bigger of the two, probably about 60 pounds, and likely born the previous winter, took a few steps closer before stopping. Its sibling, smaller and more cautious, remained at the edge of the trees, but didn't retreat. There was something in their posture, in the way they held themselves, that spoke of more than mere curiosity. Colton had been around animals his entire life, had learned to read their body language the way some men read books, and what he saw in these cubs was something he'd never encountered before. They weren't afraid, exactly, but they weren't comfortable either. They seemed to be waiting for something, watching him with a patience that felt deliberate, purposeful. When he dismounted to get a better look, they remained motionless, except for their eyes, which tracked his every movement. "You two lost?" he called out, feeling somewhat foolish for talking to wild animals but unable to shake the feeling that they might somehow understand. "Your mama's probably looking for you." But as the morning progressed and he continued his rounds, the cubs continued to follow. They maintained their distance, never approaching close enough to be a threat, but never falling so far behind that they lost sight of him. It was unnerving in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the unexpected. Rex seemed as puzzled by their behavior as Colton was. The dog's training told him to herd or chase, but something about the cubs' demeanor gave him pause. They weren't acting like prey animals, and they weren't acting aggressive. They were simply there, persistent and watchful, like mourners at a graveside. By midday, Colton had finished his usual circuit and was heading back toward the barn, hoping the cubs would lose interest and return to whatever wild business normally occupied their time. But as he unsaddled Ranger and turned him out to pasture, he could see the two small forms still visible at the tree line, still watching. The second day brought more of the same. The cubs appeared shortly after dawn, emerging from the timber as if they'd been waiting for him. They followed his entire morning routine, maintaining their respectful distance but never wavering in their attention. Colton found himself checking over his shoulder constantly, unnerved by their persistent presence. He mentioned it to Frank Mueller when they met at the fence line that afternoon. "Cubs following you?" Frank repeated, pushing his hat back and squinting toward the trees where the two bears sat like dark sentinels. "That ain't natural behavior, Colt. Cubs that age should be with their mother, learning to forage. They shouldn't be wasting time following humans around." "That's what's got me puzzled," Colton admitted. "They're not begging for food, not acting aggressive, not even particularly afraid. It's like they're trying to tell me something." Frank studied the cubs for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. My grandfather used to tell stories about animals that came to humans for help. Said it happened during the big drought of '06, when the waterholes dried up and the deer would lead settlers to hidden springs. He paused, then shook his head. Course, those were just stories. That evening, Colton called Dr. Chen. "Bear cubs following you?" she repeated, and he could hear papers rustling in the background. "How old would you estimate them to be?" 6, maybe 8 months. Born this past winter, I'd guess. Big enough to be weaned, but still young enough to need their mother. And you haven't seen the mother at all? Not hide nor hair of her. That's what's got me concerned. Cubs that age shouldn't be on their own, and they sure shouldn't be fixated on a human. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "Colton, this might sound strange, but have you considered that they might be trying to show you something? I've seen dogs lead people to injured animals. Cats bring dead mice to their owners as gifts. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for, and they understand more about human behavior than most people realize." The third day dawned grey and cold, with clouds building over the mountains that promised the season's first real snow. The cubs were waiting for him as usual, but their behavior had changed subtly. Instead of simply following, they seemed more agitated, more insistent. The larger cub would walk a few steps in one direction, then stop and look back at Colton, as if waiting for him to follow. "You want me to come with you?" Colton said aloud, feeling the words as strange as they sounded. But there was no denying what he was seeing. The cubs were trying to lead him somewhere. His rational mind told him this was foolishness, that wild animals didn't seek out human help, that he was projecting human emotions onto creatures that operated purely on instinct. But 40 years of ranching had taught him to trust his observations, and what he observed was 2 young bears who seemed desperate to communicate something they couldn't express in words. Rex whined softly, looking from Colton to the cubs and back again. The dog's instincts were telling him the same thing. These animals wanted something, needed something, and somehow they'd decided that Colton was the one who could provide it. The decision came suddenly, born of curiosity and a lifetime of responding to creatures in distress. "All right," he told the cubs, dismounting from Ranger. "Show me what's got you so worked up." The larger cub immediately turned and began walking deeper into the timber, pausing every few steps to ensure Colton was following. Its smaller sibling fell in behind, and together they began a journey that would lead Colton away from everything familiar and toward a discovery that would challenge his understanding of trust, responsibility, and the connections that bind all living things. As they walked deeper into the forest, following game trails that wound between towering pines and over fallen logs, Colton found himself thinking about Dr. Chen's words. Animals were indeed smarter than most people realized, and perhaps what he was witnessing wasn't as impossible as it seemed. Perhaps, in their own way, these cubs were simply asking for help, the only way they knew how. The trees grew thicker as they climbed, and the cubs' pace became more urgent. Whatever they wanted to show him, they were getting close. Colton checked his watch. They'd been walking for nearly an hour, moving steadily upward into country he rarely visited. Soon, he would discover exactly why 2 bear cubs had chosen to place their trust in a weathered cowboy who was still learning to understand the language of hope. The hollow lay hidden beneath a canopy of spruce and fir, carved into a hillside by decades of spring runoff, and sheltered by fallen logs and granite boulders. Colton might have walked past it a dozen times without noticing, but the cubs led him directly to its entrance, then stopped and looked back at him, with eyes that held more than animal intelligence. What he found inside changed everything. The mother bear lay on her side in the deepest part of the hollow, her massive form rising and falling with labored breathing. Even in the dim light filtering through the trees, Colton could see the dark stain of blood matting the fur along her shoulder, could smell the sharp scent of infection beginning to set in. She was conscious but weak, her eyes tracking his movement as he approached slowly, hands visible and empty. "Easy, Mama," he whispered, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "I'm here to help." The cubs positioned themselves between Colton and their mother, not aggressive but protective, watching his every move. The larger cub made a soft, huffing sound, as if trying to explain the situation, while its sibling pressed close to their mother's massive head. Colton knelt just outside the hollow's entrance, studying the wound with eyes trained by experience he'd hoped never to use again. The entry point was high on the shoulder, too high to be immediately fatal, but deep enough to cause significant damage. The bullet had passed through cleanly. He could see the exit wound on the far side, but infection was already setting in around the ragged edges. Memories flooded back unbidden, dragging him to rice paddies and jungle clearings where young men bled into foreign soil. He'd been a medic in Vietnam, trained to patch holes in human bodies under conditions that would have challenged a fully equipped hospital. The skills came back like muscle memory, unwanted but necessary. Jesus, he breathed, recognizing the work of a high-powered rifle. This wasn't the result of a hunting accident or a warning shot gone wrong. Someone had deliberately targeted this bear, had shot to wound rather than kill, and had left her to die slowly in the wilderness. In the back pocket of his jeans, Colton kept a small military surplus first aid kit, a habit left over from his army days and reinforced by decades of ranch work, where cuts and injuries were common. The kit was basic but well-stocked: sterile gauze, antiseptic, medical tape, and a few emergency antibiotics he'd acquired from Dr. Chen for treating injured livestock. Working slowly and talking constantly in low, soothing tones, Colton began cleaning the wound. The mother bear flinched but didn't pull away, as if she understood that this strange human was trying to help. Her cubs watched every movement, occasionally making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like encouragement. The bullet had missed the major arteries but had torn through muscle and possibly nicked the shoulder blade. Without proper surgical intervention, infection would kill her within days. But with basic field medicine and the right antibiotics, she might have a chance. "I know this hurts, girl," Colton murmured as he irrigated the wound with sterile water from his canteen. "But we need to get this cleaned out before it gets any worse." The antiseptic brought a sharp hiss from the bear, but she held still, her intelligent eyes fixed on his face as if she were reading his intentions. When he began packing the wound with antibiotic-soaked gauze, she actually seemed to relax, as if recognizing that the burning sensation meant healing rather than harm. The cubs had begun to trust him as well. The smaller one approached close enough to sniff his boots, while the larger one positioned itself where it could watch both Colton and the surrounding forest. They were young, but already showing the intelligence and protective instincts that would serve them well in the wild if their mother survived. As he worked, Colton found himself remembering another time, another place, when his hands had fought infection and blood loss in a desperate attempt to preserve life. Private Rodriguez, barely 19 years old, had taken shrapnel in the shoulder during a firefight near Da Nang. Colton had worked on him for 3 hours in a muddy foxhole while mortars exploded around them, using the same basic techniques he was employing now. Rodriguez had lived, had gone home to Texas, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and sent Colton a Christmas card every year until his death from cancer in 2003. Sometimes the skills we wished we'd never learned turned out to be exactly what the world needed from us. The immediate crisis stabilized, Colton sat back on his heels and considered his options. The mother bear needed more than basic field medicine. She needed antibiotics, proper wound care, and time to heal in safety. The cubs needed their mother, but they also needed food and protection while she recovered. Leaving them here alone was tantamount to signing their death warrant. The smell of blood would attract coyotes and mountain lions, predators that wouldn't hesitate to take advantage of a weakened bear and defenseless cubs. But moving the mother bear was impossible. She weighed at least 300 pounds and was in no condition to travel, which left only one option: staying with them. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the reasons this was a terrible idea. He had cattle to tend, fence to mend, and winter preparations to complete. Frank Mueller would worry when he didn't return, and Dr. Chen might stop by the ranch to find him missing. His cell phone had no signal this deep in the timber, and he'd told no one where he was going. But as he looked at the mother bear's trusting eyes and her cub's patient vigil, rationality seemed less important than responsibility. These animals had sought his help, had somehow recognized that he possessed the skills and compassion necessary to save their family. To abandon them now would be to betray a trust more sacred than any human contract. "Looks like we're camping out tonight," he told the cubs, who seemed to understand that he'd made a commitment. The larger one actually approached close enough to sniff his hand, a gesture of acceptance that touched something deep in Colton's chest. As the afternoon light began to fade, he set up a basic camp just outside the hollow. Using his belt knife, he cut pine boughs for a bed and gathered deadfall for a small fire that would provide warmth and keep larger predators at bay. The cubs settled down near their mother, but they kept one eye on Colton, as if making sure their unlikely ally wasn't planning to disappear in the night. The mother bear's breathing had steadied, and the bleeding had stopped. She would need more antibiotics and proper veterinary care, but for now, she was stable. The cubs would need food soon at their age. They were still nursing but also beginning to eat solid food. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were all alive and together. As darkness settled over the forest and the first stars appeared through the canopy overhead, Colton found himself thinking about Mary and how she would have reacted to this situation. She'd always had a soft spot for injured creatures, had nursed countless orphaned animals back to health over the years. She would have stayed too, would have understood that some responsibilities transcend convenience and safety. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. It was going to be a long night, but for the first time in months, Colton felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Dawn came slowly to the hollow, filtered through pine needles and accompanied by the soft sounds of forest awakening. Colton had slept fitfully, waking every hour to check on the mother bear and add wood to the fire. His back ached from sleeping on pine boughs, and his joints protested the cold. But the bear family was alive, and that was what mattered. The mother bear's breathing was stronger this morning, though she remained weak and largely immobile. The cubs had spent the night pressed against her massive form, drawing comfort from her warmth and presence. As Colton stirred the coals back to life, both young bears watched him with the careful attention of creatures who had learned to trust but hadn't forgotten to be cautious. "Morning, folks," he said quietly, checking his supplies. The basic first aid kit had served its purpose, but what the mother bear really needed was proper veterinary care, antibiotics, IV fluids, and professional wound management. That meant a trip back to the ranch for supplies, and it meant bringing Dr. Chen into the situation. As he reached for his wallet to find her business card, his fingers brushed against something else, a small, faded photograph of Mary, taken the summer before she died. She was kneeling beside a fawn that had been orphaned by a car strike, bottle-feeding it with the infinite patience she brought to all injured creatures. Her smile in the photograph was gentle and knowing, as if she understood something about compassion that the rest of the world was still learning. The memory hit him harder than expected. Mary would have known exactly what to do in this situation. She'd nursed injured wildlife back to health more times than he could count, had a gift for reading what animals needed and providing it without hesitation. She would have stayed the night too, would have understood that some responsibilities couldn't be delegated or postponed. "What would you do, sweetheart?" he whispered to the photograph, though he already knew the answer. Mary would have done exactly what he was planning to do, whatever it took to save this family. The larger cub had ventured closer during his moment of reflection, drawn perhaps by the subdued tone of his voice. It sat just out of arm's reach, studying his face with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding. When Colton extended his hand slowly, palm up, the cub approached cautiously and touched its nose to his fingers. The contact was electric, warm, wet, and utterly trusting. For a moment, man and bear simply regarded each other, two species separated by evolution but connected by something more fundamental than genetics. The cub's acceptance felt like a benediction, a sign that he'd been deemed worthy of their faith. "I'll be back," he promised the bear family, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The hike back to where he'd left Ranger took 40 minutes through country that seemed different now that he knew it sheltered this wounded family. Every broken branch, every disturbed patch of ground took on new significance. Someone had shot that mother bear deliberately, had left her to die slowly and painfully. The cruelty of it stirred an anger in Colton that he hadn't felt since Vietnam, a righteous fury that demanded justice. Ranger was waiting patiently where Colton had ground-tied him, grazing on the sparse grass and lifting his head with obvious relief when his rider appeared. Rex emerged from wherever he'd been hunting mice, tail wagging with the joy of reunion. The dog had remained with the horse rather than following into the deep timber border. Collies were smart that way, understanding their limitations and trusting their humans to handle situations beyond their expertise. The ride back to the ranch gave Colton time to think, to plan, and to wrestle with the implications of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just about one injured bear anymore. It was about a deliberate act of cruelty, about someone who took pleasure in causing unnecessary suffering. Frank's concerns about poaching suddenly seemed much more serious. At the ranch, he loaded his truck with supplies. More antibiotics, IV bags and tubing from his veterinary kit, blankets, camping gear, and enough food for several days. He also grabbed something he hadn't touched in years, his father's old hunting rifle, a .36, that had taken deer and elk but had never been pointed at another human being. He hoped it would stay that way. The phone call to Dr. Chen was difficult. How did you explain that you'd found an injured bear, had performed field surgery, and were now committed to nursing her back to health in the middle of nowhere? How did you convey the depth of trust that had passed between species, the sense of sacred responsibility that came with being chosen as a protector? Colton? Dr. Chen's voice was warm but concerned. Are you all right? You sound... Sarah, I need your help with something unusual, he interrupted, and I need you to trust me when I tell you that I can't explain everything over the phone. There was a pause, and he could almost hear her mental calculations. What kind of help? The veterinary kind. I've got an injured animal that needs professional care, but the situation is complicated. Complicated how? Colton chose his words carefully. The kind of complicated where the authorities might get involved, and not necessarily in a helpful way. He paused, then added, Sarah, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, if it wasn't life or death. Another pause. Longer this time. What do you need? Antibiotics. Enough for a large animal, maybe 300 pounds. Something for pain management. IV supplies if you can spare them. He hesitated, then added, and maybe some advice from someone who understands wild animals better than I do. Can you bring the animal to the clinic? No, I have to go to it. Colton, she began, then stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was different, more professional but somehow warmer too. I'll put together a kit, but I want to know what I'm getting into. You're getting into the right thing, he said simply. I can promise you that much. An hour later, Dr. Chen arrived at the ranch with a cooler full of medical supplies and an expression that mixed concern with curiosity. She was dressed for field work, boots, jeans, and a jacket that had seen plenty of outdoor use. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes held the determined look of someone ready to help, regardless of the circumstances. Before we go anywhere, she said, setting the cooler on his kitchen table, I need to know what we're dealing with. Patient confidentiality only goes so far when it involves large, wild animals and mysterious injuries. Colton met her gaze steadily. 300-pound black bear, female, gunshot wound to the shoulder. 2 cubs, depending on her survival. She's been down for at least 2 days, maybe longer. Dr. Chen's expression shifted through surprise, concern, and something that might have been anger. Someone shot a mother bear. On purpose. Close range, high-powered rifle. Shot to wound, not to kill. That's not hunting, she said flatly. That's cruelty. I know. And that's why I need your help, to make sure it doesn't end the way someone intended. She studied his face for a long moment, reading something there that seemed to satisfy her questions. All right, she said finally. Let's go save a bear. As they loaded the supplies into his truck, Colton felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Mary would have approved of Dr. Chen's immediate commitment to helping, would have recognized a kindred spirit in someone who understood that some responsibilities transcended convenience and safety. The drive back to the timber would take 20 minutes over rough country, but for the first time since finding the wounded bear, Colton felt like they might actually have a chance at success. The brass shell casing caught the afternoon light, like a small piece of evidence, waiting to tell its story. Colton found it half buried in pine needles, about 30 yards from the hollow, probably kicked aside by the shooter in his haste to leave the scene. He picked it up carefully, turning the spent cartridge over in his weathered fingers while Dr. Chen worked on the mother bear. 300 Winchester Magnum, he said quietly, recognizing the distinctive shape and size. It was a powerful round, designed for long-range hunting of large game, but this one had been fired at close range. The powder burns around the bear's wound told that story clearly enough. Dr. Chen looked up from where she knelt beside the mother bear, her hands steady as she examined the wound more thoroughly than Colton's field medicine had allowed. "That's a serious hunting cartridge," she said. "Not something you'd use unless you meant business. Or unless you wanted to cause maximum damage without an immediate kill," Colton replied, his voice carrying an edge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. The cubs had accepted Dr. Chen's presence with the same cautious trust they'd shown Colton, perhaps sensing that she meant their mother no harm. The smaller cub actually allowed her to examine its ears and eyes, submitting to her gentle handling with remarkable patience for a wild animal. "She's been shot before," Dr. Chen announced after completing her examination. "There's old scar tissue on her left hind quarter, probably from when she was younger. Someone's been using this bear for target practice." The words hit Colton like a physical blow. The idea that someone had been systematically tormenting this animal, turning her into a victim for their twisted entertainment, ignited a fury that made his hands shake. He'd seen cruelty in Vietnam, had witnessed what human beings were capable of when they abandoned their humanity, but this felt personal in a way that surprised him. "Can you save her?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Maybe." Dr. Chen's response was measured, professional. "The wound is infected, but not beyond treatment. She's dehydrated and weak, but her vital signs are stable. With proper care, antibiotics, and time to heal, she could recover." She paused, looking at the cubs who were watching their mother's treatment with anxious attention. "The question is whether we can provide that care without putting ourselves in danger." "I'm not leaving them," Colton said flatly. "I know." Her smile was understanding rather than patronizing. "I wouldn't either, but we need to be smart about this. If someone's been using this bear for sport, they might come back to finish what they started." The thought hadn't occurred to Colton, but it made sense. Whoever had shot the mother bear might return to check on their handiwork, might want to see if their victim had died slowly and painfully as intended. The idea that he and Dr. Chen could be walking into an ambush added a new dimension to an already complex situation. "We need to tell Frank," Colton decided, "and probably Sheriff Rodriguez too." "The sheriff?" Dr. Chen looked skeptical. "What are we going to tell him? That we're camping in the woods with an illegally treated wild animal?" It was a valid concern. Technically, what they were doing probably violated several state and federal regulations regarding wildlife management, treating wild animals without proper permits, interfering with natural selection, potentially habituating dangerous animals to human contact. The list of possible charges could be extensive if someone decided to make an issue of it. But Colton had spent his entire life in this county, had known Sheriff Rodriguez since the man was a deputy fresh out of the academy. There were laws, and then there was justice, and sometimes the two didn't align perfectly. "I'll call Frank first," Colton said. "He's got a right to know there might be dangerous people operating on property adjacent to his ranch. As for the sheriff," he paused, considering, "Rodriguez is a good man. He'll understand the difference between helping an injured animal and breaking the law for profit." Dr. Chen began preparing an IV line for the mother bear, her movements efficient and confident despite the unusual circumstances. "We're going to need someone to watch our backs," she said. "If these poachers are organized enough to use tracking equipment, they're probably not going to be scared off by a couple of middle-aged civilians with good intentions." The observation was sobering but accurate. Colton was 58, Dr. Chen was 43, and neither of them was equipped for a confrontation with armed criminals. But they were also the only hope this bear family had, and abandoning them wasn't an option either of them was willing to consider. "One step at a time," Colton said, watching as Dr. Chen gently inserted the IV needle into the mother bear's front leg. The bear flinched but didn't pull away, as if she understood that the temporary discomfort meant healing and hope. The cubs had positioned themselves where they could watch the proceedings while maintaining a clear escape route, young but already wise in the ways of survival. The larger cub had begun to show signs of protectiveness toward both Colton and Dr. Chen, occasionally huffing softly when birds or squirrels approached too closely, as if it had appointed itself guardian of this unlikely alliance. As the afternoon wore on and the mother bear began to show signs of improvement from the IV fluids and antibiotics, Colton found himself studying the surrounding area with new eyes. The hollow was well concealed, but not impossible to find if someone knew what to look for. The poachers had obviously located it once they could do so again, which meant that recovery location might need to be moved, despite the difficulty and risk involved in transporting a 300-pound wild animal. The thought of loading an injured bear into his truck struck him as both logistically challenging and potentially suicidal, but staying in a location known to dangerous criminals seemed equally unwise. "Sarah," he said quietly, using her first name without thinking about it, "what do you know about moving large animals?" She looked up from adjusting the IV drip rate. "Professionally or practically?" "Both. Professionally, you sedate them heavily and use specialized equipment operated by trained personnel." She paused, studying his face. "Practically, you're talking about something that could get us all killed, but it could be done. Maybe, with the right drugs, the right equipment, and a lot of luck." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "Why? What are you thinking?" Colton showed her the brass casing, explaining his concerns about the poachers returning to check their work. As he spoke, he watched understanding dawn in her eyes, followed quickly by the same protective anger that had been driving his own decisions. "There's another problem," she said slowly. "If we move her, we need somewhere safe to take her, somewhere the cubs can learn to be wild again once she's healed." It was a good point, and one that brought the larger implications of their situation into sharp focus. They weren't just saving an injured animal, they were protecting a family, preserving a piece of wilderness that belonged to forces older and more important than human law or convenience. "I might know a place," Colton said, thinking of the remote canyon on the backside of his property, where he'd never run cattle, where the springs ran year-round, and the forest was thick enough to hide a family of bears from anyone who might wish them harm. Through his father's old binoculars, Colton could see the tire tracks as clearly as if they'd been drawn with chalk on dark paper. The tracks led from a logging road about half a mile away, winding through the timber in a path that suggested the driver knew exactly where he was going. Someone had been here recently, within the last few days, judging by the clarity of the impressions in the soft earth. "Professional," Dr. Chen observed quietly, studying the tracks through her own compact field glasses. "See how they backed out? They didn't want to get trapped by terrain or weather. This wasn't some drunk weekend warrior taking potshots at wildlife." The mother bear was showing remarkable improvement after 18 hours of IV fluids and antibiotics. She could lift her head now, could move her injured shoulder slightly without obvious pain. The cubs had begun ranging farther from her side, testing their confidence in this new arrangement where humans seemed to help rather than harm. But the tire tracks changed everything. They spoke of organization, planning, and the kind of methodical cruelty that came from people who treated suffering as entertainment. Colton had seen similar tracks around other remote areas of his property over the past few weeks, places where elk gathered, where deer came to water, where families of wildlife lived their ancient lives according to rhythms older than human settlement. "We need backup," he said, lowering the binoculars and meeting Dr. Chen's concerned gaze. "This is bigger than one injured bear." The phone call to Frank Mueller was brief and to the point. Frank listened without interruption as Colton described the wounded bear, the evidence of systematic poaching, and the tire tracks that suggested an organized operation. "I'll be there in an hour," Frank said simply, "and I'm bringing some insurance." Sheriff Rodriguez was a different conversation entirely. Pete Rodriguez had grown up in the county, had known Colton since they were both young men figuring out their places in the world. He'd been a fair sheriff for 15 years, understanding the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice that made communities work. "Let me get this straight," Rodriguez said after Colton had explained the situation. "You've got an injured bear, evidence of illegal poaching, and you're providing medical care in the field rather than contacting Fish and Game. That's about the size of it, and you're calling me because you think these poachers might come back." "I'm calling you because this isn't about one bear anymore, Pete. Someone's running an organized operation on public land, and they're not going to stop until someone makes them stop." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Fish and Game is going to want to know about the bear." "I know. And technically, what you're doing probably violates about 6 different regulations." "I know that too." Another pause. "But anyone who shoots a mother bear and leaves her to die slowly while her cubs watch is a piece of human garbage who needs to be stopped." "That's what I was hoping you'd say." "All right, I'll make some calls, see what I can find out about unusual activity in the area. But Colton, if this situation goes sideways, I can't protect you from the bureaucracy. You understand that?" "I understand. Thanks, Pete." Frank arrived as promised, driving his ancient Ford pickup and accompanied by his nephew Danny, a Iraq War veteran who'd been managing Frank's ranch since returning from his 3rd deployment. Danny was 35, quiet, and had the kind of alert watchfulness that came from places where inattention could be fatal. "Uncle Frank filled me in," Danny said after they'd hiked to the hollow and surveyed the situation. "You've got yourselves a real problem here." The two men studied the tire tracks with professional interest, noting details that Colton's rancher's eye had missed. Danny pointed out where someone had attempted to obscure footprints, where equipment had been unloaded and reloaded, where the poachers had taken time to scout the area before approaching the bear family. "Military precision," Danny observed. "These aren't amateur hunters. They've got training, equipment, and a plan." Frank was examining the brass shell casing with the attention of someone who'd been around firearms his entire life. "Custom loads," he announced. "This cartridge was hand-loaded for maximum velocity and impact. Someone spent time and money making ammunition specifically designed to cause maximum tissue damage without immediate lethality." The implications sent a chill down Colton's spine. They weren't dealing with casual cruelty or opportunistic criminals. This was organized, deliberate, and designed to maximize suffering. Dr. Chen emerged from the hollow where she'd been checking on the mother bear. "She's ready to move," she announced. "Not easily, and not without risk, but she's strong enough to survive transport if we're careful." "Move her where?" Frank asked. Colton had been thinking about that question since discovering the tire tracks. His ranch had several remote areas that would provide safety and seclusion, but moving a 300-pound wild animal required planning, equipment, and considerable risk. "There's a box canyon on the back of my property," he said slowly. "Natural springs, thick timber, only one way in or out. If we could get her there, she'd have time to heal properly while the cubs learn to forage." "How do we transport a bear?" Dr. Chen asked practically. Danny had been studying the terrain with tactical eyes. "Truck bed with a cage, probably. Sedate her heavily, move fast, pray she doesn't wake up angry." He paused, then added, "I've got a friend who works for Fish and Game. Might be able to borrow some equipment if we ask nice." "Won't that create problems with the authorities?" Colton asked. "Depends on how we ask," Danny replied with a slight smile. My friend Jake understands the difference between following regulations and doing the right thing. As evening approached and the forest settled into its nighttime rhythms, the group established a more substantial camp. Frank and Danny had brought military surplus gear that transformed their presence from temporary to semi-permanent. Motion sensors around the perimeter would alert them to approaching vehicles or large animals. Night vision equipment would let them monitor the surrounding area without revealing their position. The cubs had begun to accept the expanded human presence with remarkable adaptability. The smaller one had even approached Frank during the afternoon, drawn by the old rancher's patient stillness and gentle voice. It was a sign of trust that spoke to something fundamental about the relationship between humans and the wild creatures that shared their world. "They know we're trying to help," Dr. Chen observed, watching the larger cub settle down near the fire for warmth. "Animals are better judges of character than most people realize." As the first stars appeared overhead and the mother bear slept peacefully under the influence of pain medication, Colton found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment. 3 days ago, he'd been a lonely widower going through the motions of ranch work. Now he was part of a conspiracy to protect a wild family from human cruelty, surrounded by people who understood that some responsibilities transcended law and convenience. Through his father's binoculars, he scanned the dark forest one more time before settling in for the night watch. Somewhere out there, the poachers might be planning their return. But they would find a very different situation than the helpless victims they'd left behind. They would find people willing to fight for something more important than themselves. The GPS tracking collar was hidden so well that Danny almost missed it entirely. Tucked beneath a fallen log about 20 yards from the hollow, it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for surveillance equipment. The device was small, black, and expensive-looking, the kind of technology that spoke of serious money and professional operation. "Son of a bitch," Danny breathed, carefully extracting the collar without touching it directly. "They've been tracking her movements." Dr. Chen looked up from where she was preparing the mother bear for transport. "Tracking what movements?" "The bear family. This collar was designed to monitor their location in real time." Danny examined the device with the careful attention of someone who'd encountered similar technology in military operations. "See this antenna array? This thing can transmit location data to receivers up to 50 miles away." The implications hit Colton like a physical blow. "They weren't randomly hunting," he said slowly. "They were farming." Frank's weathered face had gone pale. "Farming, using the bears like livestock," Colton explained, the full horror of the situation becoming clear. "Track them, wound them periodically to create stress and fear, then hunt them again when they'd recovered enough to provide sport." Dr. Chen's hands had stopped moving entirely. "That's not hunting, that's torture." Danny was studying the collar more closely, his expression growing darker by the moment. "There's more. See these ports? This collar was designed to deliver something, probably tranquilizers or other drugs. They could sedate the bears remotely, move them to different locations, control their behavior entirely." The mother bear, as if sensing the conversation about her torment, lifted her head and looked directly at the tracking collar in Danny's hands. Her eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and for a moment, Colton could swear he saw recognition and relief that her electronic leash had finally been discovered. "How long?" Dr. Chen asked quietly. "Based on the wear patterns and battery life, probably 6 months," Danny replied. "Maybe longer. 6 months of systematic torture, 6 months of being hunted, wounded, tracked, and terrorized while trying to raise her cubs and survive in the wild." The cruelty was beyond anything Colton had imagined possible, even after his experiences in Vietnam. But the discovery of the collar also explained something that had been puzzling him since the beginning: why the cubs had sought him out specifically. They hadn't been randomly looking for help. They'd learned to associate humans with their mother's suffering, but they'd also somehow recognized that not all humans were the same. "They chose me," he said aloud, the realization carrying a weight that made his chest tight. Somehow, These cubs understood the difference between the people who'd been hurting their mother and someone who might help. Frank was examining the tire tracks again, his expression grim. If they've been using tracking equipment, they know exactly where the bear is right now, which means they know about us too. The thought sent a chill through the group. If the poachers had been monitoring the bear's location continuously, they would have noticed when she stopped moving 3 days ago. They would have seen when additional heat signatures appeared in the area, when Colton first arrived, when Dr. Chen joined him, when Frank and Danny set up their expanded camp. "We're not rescuing a bear," Danny said flatly. "We're interfering with a business operation. And judging by the sophistication of this equipment, it's a business with serious money behind it." Dr. Chen had resumed her preparations for moving the mother bear, but her movements were more urgent now. "How soon can we get her out of here?" "Jake's bringing the transport cage within the hour," Danny replied, checking his watch. "But if they've been monitoring the situation, they might already be on their way." As if summoned by his words, the motion sensors around their perimeter began to beep softly, the signal that large objects were moving through the forest in their direction. Danny immediately switched to tactical mode, hand signaling for silence while he checked the night vision scope. "2 vehicles," he whispered, "coming from different directions. They're trying to box us in." Colton felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same heightened awareness he'd experienced in combat zones, where survival depended on quick thinking and decisive action. But this wasn't Vietnam, and the stakes weren't just his own life, they were the lives of an innocent family that had placed their trust in his protection. "Options?" he asked quietly. "Fight or run," Danny replied. "But running means leaving the bear, and fighting means risking everyone's life." Dr. Chen was working frantically to stabilize the mother bear for emergency transport. "She's not ready for this," she said. "Moving her now could kill her." The cubs seemed to sense the tension in the air. They pressed closer to their mother, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like whimpers. The larger cub looked directly at Colton, its dark eyes holding a plea that transcended species barriers. Frank had positioned himself where he could watch the main approach route, his old deer rifle ready but held low. 30 years ago, I'd have been itching for this fight," he said quietly. "Now I'm just hoping these boys are smart enough to back down when they see we're serious." But Colton was beginning to understand that backing down wasn't an option for people running the kind of operation they'd discovered. Too much money was involved, too much investment in equipment and planning. The poachers couldn't afford to let witnesses walk away, couldn't risk exposure of what was probably a multi-state criminal enterprise. "Danny," he said quietly, "call Jake. Tell him we need that transport cage now, and we need backup. Official backup." "Already on it," Danny replied, speaking rapidly into his satellite phone. "Jake's 15 minutes out with the cage, and he's bringing friends from Fish and Game and the state police." The vehicles were getting closer, their engines audible now through the forest canopy. Whoever was coming wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. They were counting on overwhelming force and intimidation to resolve the situation in their favor. Dr. Chen finished securing the IV line and looked up at Colton. "Whatever happens, we can't let them take her back." He understood exactly what she meant. The mother bear had suffered enough, had endured months of systematic torture that violated every principle of human decency. Even if it cost them their lives, they couldn't allow that cycle of cruelty to continue. "We won't," he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The cubs seemed to understand that their world was about to change again. But instead of cowering in fear, as they might have done 3 days ago, they positioned themselves protectively near their mother and looked to the humans who had earned their trust. It was a moment of absolute faith that cut through Colton's heart like a blade. The first vehicle appeared through the trees, a large pickup truck with tinted windows and custom modifications that suggested military or law enforcement origins. Behind it, the sound of a second engine grew steadily louder. Danny raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it, but making its presence known. "Here we go," he said quietly. But as the truck drew closer, Colton noticed something that made him lower his own weapon. The vehicle bore official markings, Fish and Game logos on the doors, emergency lights on the roof, and the distinctive profile of government-issued equipment. "Hold your fire," he called out. "That's Jake." The rescue had arrived, but Colton couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was just beginning. The poachers knew about the tracking collar, knew their operation had been discovered, and they wouldn't give up their valuable assets without a fight. As Jake's team began setting up the transport cage and preparing to move the mother bear to safety, Colton found himself scanning the forest with his father's binoculars, looking for signs of the real threat that was still out there, still watching, still planning. The GPS collar lay disabled on the ground beside the hollow, its electronic tyranny finally broken. But the people who had placed it there were still free, still dangerous, and now they knew that their victims had found protectors willing to fight back. Jake Martinez emerged from the Fish and Game truck like a man who'd been preparing for this moment his entire career. 38 years old, built like the college linebacker he'd once been, and carrying the quiet authority that came from 15 years of dealing with both wildlife and the kind of people who abused it. Behind him came 2 state police officers and a federal wildlife agent whose presence meant this situation had already escalated beyond local jurisdiction. "Danny filled me in on the radio," Jake said without preamble, surveying the scene with professional eyes. "GPS tracking collar, systematic torture, organized poaching ring. We've been looking for these bastards for 8 months. The federal agent, a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Special Agent Rebecca Torres, knelt beside the disabled tracking collar with the reverence of someone handling crucial evidence. "This is the break we've been waiting for," she said. "We've had reports of similar operations in Colorado, Montana, and Idaho. Always the same pattern, high-value wildlife tracked and tortured for the entertainment of clients willing to pay premium prices for guaranteed hunts." Dr. Chen looked up from her final preparations of the mother bear. "Clients? Rich sociopaths who get bored with conventional hunting," Agent Torres explained. "They pay top dollar to hunt animals that have been pre-stressed, pre-wounded, and tracked in real time. Takes all the uncertainty out of the experience while maximizing the animal's suffering." The casual description of such calculated cruelty made Colton's hands clench into fists. He'd seen the worst of human nature in Vietnam, but this seemed to represent a new category of evil cruelty as luxury entertainment, suffering as a purchased commodity. Jake was examining the transport cage that had been unloaded from a specialized trailer. "She's going to fit, but it's going to be tight. How's her condition?" "Stable but weak," Dr. Chen replied. "The sedation should keep her calm during transport, but any major stress could cause complications." The cubs watched the flurry of human activity with the patient attention they'd shown throughout their ordeal. They seemed to understand that these new humans were connected to the ones who'd been helping their mother, but they remained cautious, ready to bolt if the situation turned threatening. Agent Torres was coordinating with her headquarters via satellite phone, her voice low but urgent. "We need surveillance on all known access roads within a 20-mile radius," she was saying. "If they've been monitoring this location electronically, they know their operation has been compromised." Frank had positioned himself at a vantage point where he could watch the main approaches to the hollow. His old rancher's instincts were telling him that trouble was coming, and Danny had learned to trust his uncle's intuition about such things. "Movement on the ridgeline," Frank called out quietly. "2 vehicles, maybe 3, coming from the northwest." Jake immediately switched to operational mode, directing his team to positions that would provide both protection and clear fields of fire if the situation deteriorated. The state police officers began setting up a perimeter while Agent Torres continued her coordination with federal backup. "How long to get the bear loaded and moving?" Jake asked Dr. Chen. 10 minutes if everything goes smoothly," she replied. "Longer if she fights the sedation." "She won't fight," Colton said with surprising certainty. "She trusts us." As if to prove his point, the mother bear allowed herself to be guided into the transport cage with minimal resistance. The cubs followed close behind, unwilling to be separated from their mother, even in this strange and frightening situation. Danny had retrieved his grandfather's hand-carved wooden whistle from his pack, a simple instrument that had been used to call cattle for 3 generations. He'd been practicing with it during their time in the hollow, and the cubs had learned to associate its sound with safety and reassurance. "If things go bad," Danny told Colton, "use this to signal the cubs. They'll come to you rather than running blind into the forest." The whistle felt warm in Colton's palm, worn smooth by decades of use. It represented something important about continuity, about the passing of knowledge and responsibility from one generation to the next. His grandfather had carved it, his father had used it, and now it might serve to protect a family that had placed their trust in human compassion. Agent Torres finished her call and approached the group with news that chilled everyone present. "We've identified the vehicles approaching our position. They belong to Marcus Kellerman and his associates, professional poachers with connections to international wildlife trafficking. These people are extremely dangerous and extremely well armed." "How dangerous?" Jake asked. "Kellerman's a former military contractor who's been operating illegal hunting operations across the western United States. His clients include foreign nationals willing to pay 6 figures for exotic hunting experiences. He's suspected in the deaths of 3 federal agents in Montana last year." The information transformed their situation from wildlife rescue to potential combat operation. They weren't dealing with local criminals anymore. They were facing professional killers who viewed human life as just another obstacle to their business operations. "We should call for more backup," one of the state police officers suggested. "No time," Agent Torres replied. "Kellerman's pattern is to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. If we wait for reinforcements, everyone here dies, and the bears disappear into his trafficking network." Dr. Chen had finished securing the mother bear in the transport cage, but her hands were shaking slightly as she checked the IV connections one final time. "I'm a veterinarian," she said quietly. "I didn't sign up for a gunfight." "None of us did," Colton replied, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But sometimes we don't get to choose what we're called to do." The cubs were becoming agitated, sensing the tension in the air and the urgency of the human activity around them. The smaller one had pressed itself against the transport cage, trying to maintain physical contact with its mother. The larger one positioned itself where it could watch all the humans while maintaining a clear escape route. Jake was checking his equipment with the methodical precision of someone who'd been in similar situations before. "The good news is that we know this terrain better than they do. The bad news is that they've probably been planning this operation for weeks." "What's the plan?" Frank asked, his old deer rifle held ready but pointed safely toward the ground. "We get the bears out of here," Agent Torres said simply. "Everything else is secondary to that objective." Danny had been studying the approaching vehicles through night vision equipment. 3 trucks, military-style modifications, at least 8 personnel. They're setting up a perimeter to prevent escape rather than mounting a direct assault. "They want to capture rather than kill," Agent Torres observed. "The bears are valuable assets. They'll try to take them alive if possible." "Over my dead body," Colton said quietly, and meant every word. The federal agent looked at him with new respect. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But if it does, we need everyone to understand that these people have killed federal agents. They won't hesitate to kill civilians who get in their way." As the first headlights appeared through the forest canopy, Jake began the process of starting the transport vehicle. The engine turned over with a reassuring rumble, but everyone present understood that getting out of the hollow would require navigating past armed criminals who had no intention of letting their valuable assets escape. Agent Torres was speaking rapidly into her radio, calling in air support and additional federal units, but everyone knew that help was still hours away. Whatever happened in the next 30 minutes would determine whether the Bear family lived or died, whether justice prevailed or cruelty triumphed. Colton found himself thinking about Mary and what she would have done in this situation. She would have been afraid any sane person would be afraid, but she wouldn't have backed down. She would have understood that some things were worth risking everything to protect. The cubs seemed to sense that their world was about to change again, But this time, they looked to the humans who had earned their trust, rather than cowering in fear. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on everyone present, a sacred trust that couldn't be betrayed, regardless of the personal cost. Through his father's binoculars, Colton could see armed figures moving through the forest, professional and methodical in their approach. The final confrontation was beginning, and everything they'd worked for, everything the bear family represented about the possibility of trust between species, hung in the balance. The wooden whistle felt solid and reassuring in his hand, a connection to generations of men who had protected what they loved, regardless of the danger. Soon, he might need to use it to call the cubs to safety, to honor the trust they'd placed in his protection. The battle for a family's freedom was about to begin. The first tranquilizer dart hit the tree beside Colton's head with a soft thunk that spoke of professional equipment and deadly intent. Marcus Kellerman's voice carried clearly through the forest darkness, amplified by military-grade communication equipment. "You're interfering with a lawful business operation," the voice announced with the cold authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Return our property, and you can walk away from this." Agent Torres had positioned herself behind the transport trailer, her weapon drawn and her radio crackling with updates from federal backup, still 20 minutes away. "There's nothing lawful about animal torture," she called back. "FBI, you're surrounded." Kellerman's laugh carried genuine amusement. "Agent Torres, I presume. We've been monitoring your communications for the past hour. Your backup is delayed by a convenient rockslide on Highway 14. You're on your own." The implications sent a chill through Colton's spine. These people had the resources and planning capability to manipulate federal response times, to coordinate their operations across multiple states while staying ahead of law enforcement. They weren't just criminals, they were professionals operating with military precision. Jake had the transport vehicle running, but the narrow track leading out of the hollow created a natural choke point that Kellerman's people had undoubtedly blocked. The mother bear was secure in her cage, but the cubs were becoming increasingly agitated as the smell of strange humans filled the air. "Movement on the south ridge," Danny reported from his position near the perimeter sensors. "4 personnel with night vision and what looks like capture equipment. They're trying to box us in." Dr. Chen was crouched beside the transport cage, speaking softly to the mother bear in tones meant to calm both the animal and herself. The bear's eyes were alert despite the sedation, tracking the movement of armed figures through the trees with the intelligence of a creature that had learned to associate humans with pain and fear. Colton found himself holding his grandfather's Colt .45 revolver, a weapon he'd hoped never to use against another human being. The weight of it in his hand carried the gravity of 60 years of family history, of men who had protected what they loved, regardless of the personal cost. The larger cub had positioned itself near Colton's feet, not seeking protection, but offering it a gesture of loyalty that cut through his fear like sunlight through storm clouds. These animals had chosen to trust him, had somehow recognized that not all humans were monsters, and that trust created a responsibility he couldn't abandon. "They're using thermal imaging," Frank observed from his vantage point, overlooking the main approach. "Professional equipment, military tactics. These boys have done this before." A spotlight blazed to life from the ridge above them, bathing the hollow in harsh white light that destroyed their night vision and turned them into easy targets. Kellerman's voice followed immediately, now speaking through a bullhorn with the authority of someone delivering an ultimatum. "You have exactly 60 seconds to return our animals and surrender your weapons. After that, we take what belongs to us and leave no witnesses." Agent Torres was speaking rapidly into her radio, but Colton could see the hopelessness in her expression. Federal backup was too far away, local law enforcement was outgunned, and Kellerman's people had the high ground and superior equipment. "Jake," Colton called out quietly, "can you get that truck moving if we give you cover?" "Maybe, but the track's narrow and they'll have a clear shot at the engine block from the ridge." The 60 seconds were ticking away with mechanical precision, each moment bringing them closer to a confrontation that would determine whether justice or cruelty prevailed. The cubs seemed to sense the approaching violence, pressing closer to their human protectors while their mother watched from behind the bars of her transport cage. Danny had been studying the terrain with tactical eyes, looking for advantages that might offset their numerical and equipment disadvantages. "There's a game trail that leads up the back of the ridge," he said quietly. "Steep, but it would put us above their position." "How many people?" Agent Torres asked. "2, maybe 3, but it would split our forces and leave the bears vulnerable." Kellerman's voice cut through their planning with cold finality. "Time's up. You had your chance." The first shots came from multiple directions simultaneously, not bullets, but tranquilizer darts, designed to incapacitate rather than kill. They wanted prisoners, wanted to eliminate witnesses while keeping their valuable animals alive for future torture. Colton threw himself behind a fallen log as darts thudded into the wood around him. The cubs scattered instinctively, but the larger one stopped after just a few yards, looking back at him with eyes that held a question he couldn't misinterpret. "Go!" he shouted, pulling the wooden whistle from his pocket. "I'll call you when it's safe." The sharp blast of the whistle sent both cubs racing toward the deeper forest, following escape routes they'd learned during months of avoiding their tormentors. At least they would survive whatever happened here. But as armed figures began their final approach through the trees, Colton realized that survival might not be an option for any of the humans who had dared to interfere with Marcus Kellerman's profitable cruelty. The emergency flare gun belonged to Jake's standard fish and game equipment, designed for signaling rescue helicopters in remote wilderness areas. But as Colton gripped it in his left hand while keeping his grandfather's revolver ready in his right, he knew it might serve a very different purpose tonight. Danny had made his move up the game trail, using his military training to reach the high ground where Kellerman's spotlights couldn't penetrate. The sound of his movement was covered by the increasing chaos in the hollow as tranquilizer darts continued to fly and Agent Torres returned fire with her service weapon. "They're trying to take the transport truck," Jake shouted from behind the engine block, where he'd taken cover after 2 darts had missed his head by inches. The mother bear was visible through the cage bars, alert and watching the human conflict with intelligence that seemed to grasp the stakes involved. Frank had positioned himself where his deer rifle could cover the main approach, but he was 72 years old and facing professional killers with military equipment. The odds were impossible, but the old rancher held his ground with the stubborn courage that had sustained 3 generations of his family on this unforgiving land. Dr. Chen was pressed against the transport trailer's wheel well, her veterinary training useless in a situation that called for combat skills she'd never needed to develop. But when one of Kellerman's men appeared through the trees, moving to flank their position, she proved that courage came in many forms. "Behind you!" she shouted, alerting Agent Torres to the threat, just as the federal agent spun and put 2 rounds center mass into the approaching figure. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Kellerman's people had night vision, superior numbers, and the high ground. Worse, they were using non-lethal weapons, while the rescue team was forced to use deadly force, a psychological disadvantage that spoke to the criminals' confidence in their eventual victory. "Jake, get that engine started," Agent Torres commanded while reloading her weapon. "We're leaving now, whether the road's clear or not." But as Jake moved toward the driver's seat, a tranquilizer dart caught him in the shoulder. He stumbled, his coordination already beginning to fail as the powerful sedative entered his bloodstream. "I got it," Colton called out, abandoning his cover to reach the transport truck. A dart whistled past his ear as he dove for the driver's door, his grandfather's revolver forgotten in his focus on saving the Bear family that had trusted him with their lives. The engine was already running, but the narrow track leading out of the hollow was blocked by one of Kellerman's vehicles. Getting past would require ramming through or finding another route, neither option particularly appealing when carrying a 300-pound injured bear and 2 terrified cubs somewhere in the surrounding forest. That's when Danny's voice came through the darkness from the ridge above. "I've got eyes on their command position. Kellerman's coordinating from a mobile unit about 200 yards northwest." The information gave Colton an idea born of desperation and the kind of tactical thinking he'd learned in places where conventional solutions meant death. If they couldn't fight their way out, maybe they could create enough chaos to escape in the confusion. He raised the emergency flare gun toward the ridge where the spotlight was mounted, took careful aim despite the tranquilizer darts still flying around him, and pulled the trigger. The flare streaked upward like a miniature meteor, its brilliant red light turning night into day and destroying the night vision of everyone watching. "Move! Move! Move!" he shouted, throwing the truck into gear and pointing it toward the blocked trail. Behind him, Agent Torres and Dr. Chen scrambled into the transport compartment while Frank provided covering fire from his position near the tree line. The truck lurched forward just as the flare reached its peak brightness, casting weird shadows through the forest and temporarily blinding Kellerman's spotters. Colton aimed for the gap between two pine trees, knowing that the trailer carrying the mother bear would either make it through or be torn apart by the impact. Metal screamed against bark as the trailer scraped between the trees, but it held together long enough to clear the obstacle. The mother bear was thrown against the side of her cage, but remained conscious, her dark eyes fixed on Colton's face in the rearview mirror as if she understood that this wild ride was her ticket to freedom. Behind them, automatic weapons fire erupted as Kellerman's people realized their prey was escaping. Bullets shattered the truck's rear window and punched holes in the trailer's side panels, but the vehicle's momentum carried them through the worst of the ambush. "Danny's still up there," Dr. Chen shouted over the noise of gunfire and grinding gears. "He'll be fine," Colton replied with more confidence than he felt. "Military training. He knows how to disappear when things get hot." But as they reached the main logging road and he pushed the accelerator to the floor, Colton could see pursuit vehicles starting their engines in his side mirrors. The escape was just beginning, and Marcus Kellerman wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. The emergency flare was still burning on the ridge behind them, a beacon of defiance that announced to the Wyoming wilderness that sometimes ordinary people found the courage to fight for something more important than their own safety. 6 months later, Colton stood in the canyon on the back of his property, where a simple wooden cross marked the place where trust had been born between species. The cross was rough-hewn from local pine, carved with his own hands during the long winter evenings when the memory of that October night still made his chest tight with emotion. The mother bear had recovered completely. Dr. Chen's expert care and the sanctuary of the hidden canyon had given her the time and safety needed to heal both physically and psychologically. The cubs had grown into confident young adults, still recognizable but independent now, ready to face the world with the wisdom their ordeal had taught them. Marcus Kellerman was serving 3 consecutive life sentences in federal prison, along with most of his organization. The GPS tracking evidence had broken open a wildlife trafficking ring that spanned 6 states and involved over $40 million in illegal hunting operations. Agent Torres had received a commendation for her work on the case, though she'd told Colton privately that the real heroes were ordinary citizens who'd risked everything to protect creatures that couldn't protect themselves. Danny had escaped from the ridge that night by following game trails he'd learned as a boy, emerging 3 miles away to find federal backup finally arriving. His military skills had proved invaluable in identifying and dismantling the rest of Kellerman's surveillance network, ensuring that no other wildlife families would suffer similar torture. Jake had recovered from the tranquilizer dart with no lasting effects, though he joked that being sedated by professionals had been the best sleep he'd gotten in years. Fish and Game had implemented new protocols for dealing with organized poaching operations, and Jake had been promoted to head a new wildlife crimes unit that was already making a difference across the region. Sheriff Rodriguez had quietly ensured that no charges were filed against any of the civilians involved in the rescue operation. As he'd told the federal prosecutors, sometimes doing the right thing required bending rules that hadn't been written with real-world situations in mind. Frank Mueller had become something of a local legend, the 72-year-old rancher who'd faced down professional killers to protect a bear family. He'd taken to giving talks at schools about wildlife conservation, always ending with the observation that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right, despite being afraid. Dr. Chen had expanded her practice to include wildlife rehabilitation, using the skills she'd developed during the bear rescue to help other injured animals. She and Colton had grown closer over the months of recovery and legal proceedings, finding in each other the kind of deep companionship that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. But it was the bear family themselves that had provided the most profound transformation. Watching them learn to trust again, seeing the cubs grow strong and confident under their mother's renewed protection, had given Colton a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Mary's death. He'd begun volunteering with wildlife conservation groups, sharing his story at fundraising events and legislative hearings. The ranch was still his home, still required the daily attention that had shaped 3 generations of his family. But now, it also served as an unofficial sanctuary for injured wildlife, a place where Dr. Chen brought animals that needed the kind of patient, long-term care that couldn't be provided in a conventional clinic. The cubs still visited occasionally, usually in the early morning hours when the mist clung to the valley floor. They were wild animals now, following their own paths through the mountain wilderness, but they remembered the humans who had saved their family. The larger cub, now a substantial young adult, would sometimes sit at the edge of the tree line and watch Colton work, a reminder of the trust that had changed both their lives. Mary's presence was still felt in the house, in the blue and white checkered curtains and the ceramic rooster collection. But the overwhelming sadness that had marked the first years after her death had been replaced by something warmer gratitude for the time they'd shared, and recognition that her legacy of compassion lived on in the work he was doing. The pocket watch still marked the passage of time with the same steady rhythm, but the hours felt different now. Instead of empty stretches to be endured, they were filled with purpose and connection. The land that had felt lonely and burdensome had become a sanctuary where healing could take place. On this particular morning, as he stood beside the simple wooden cross that marked the beginning of an extraordinary friendship, Colton could hear the sound of Dr. Chen's truck coming up the canyon road. She was bringing another patient, a young elk that had been injured by poachers operating in Colorado, part of Kellerman's network that was still being dismantled. The work continued, the healing continued, and the trust between species that had begun with 2 desperate cubs continued to grow and spread. Sometimes, Colton reflected, the most important changes in life came not from seeking purpose, but from allowing purpose to find you. As Dr. Chen's truck appeared through the trees, Colton touched the wooden cross one more time and headed down to help with the new arrival. Somewhere in the forest, he knew the bear family was going about their daily business with the confidence that came from knowing they were protected by humans, who understood that some responsibilities transcended species barriers. The message they had carried that October morning, that trust could bridge any divide, that compassion could overcome cruelty, that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences, continued to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. And in a world that often seemed dominated by selfishness and cruelty, that message had never been more important. The little bears had led a lonely cowboy to discover that his greatest purpose lay not in the land he owned, but in the trust he could earn from creatures who had every reason to fear human contact. It was a lesson worth carrying forward, one wooden cross and one rescued family at a time.